My grandson kicked me, so I scolded him just once. The next day, my daughter-in-law showed up at my door, pulled my hair, and made a huge scene in front of the whole neighborhood. She just didn't expect a visit from the court officer. Helen Miller had always found solace in the quiet rhythm of her days. At 68 years old, she cherished the calm of her modest home in suburban Connecticut. Her mornings began with coffee on the porch, the scent of blooming hydrangeas floating through the air, and ended with books or crosswords by the fireplace. Twice a week, her grandson Lucas, a sprightly 6-year-old with a head full of curls and a relentless curiosity, would visit after school. Those afternoons brought a burst of energy into her otherwise tranquil life. She loved the boy deeply, sometimes to the point of tears when he left. That particular Thursday had started like any other. The sky was bright, with patches of white clouds drifting lazily overhead. Helen had baked oatmeal cookies, Lucas's favorite, and set them out with milk on the patio table. The boy had arrived a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, dropped off by his mother, Jennifer, who barely made eye contact before it turned her car with a hurried wave. It wasn't unusual. Jennifer had always been distant, civil at best, frosty at worst. Lucas, on the other hand, was his usual bundle of energy. He devoured 2 cookies in minutes, then begged Helen to come play outside. They settled in the backyard, where Helen had built a little play area years ago, complete with a wooden swing and a sandbox that had seen better days. They played catch with foam ball, and then Lucas began constructing a castle with plastic blocks Helen kept in a bin by the porch. As the afternoon wore on, Lucas's mood shifted. He asked for a popsicle, his third of the day, and Helen, gently but firmly, told him no. It was too close to dinner, and she didn't want him spoiling his appetite. Lucas's face crumpled in an instant. He stomped his foot, threw a toy across the lawn, and let out a loud whine that pierced the quiet of the neighborhood. "Lucas," Helen said, trying to keep her voice calm, "we've talked about this. You already had your treats." "I want another one," he screamed. Helen stood her ground, walking toward her with a hand outstretched to comfort him. That's when it happened. Lucas, red-faced and breathing hard, lifted his leg and kicked her squarely on the shin. The pain caught her off guard, not just physical, but emotional. Her mouth dropped open, more in disbelief than in hurt. She took a moment to steady herself before looking him straight in the eye. "Lucas," she snapped, her voice firm, "that is not how we treat people, especially not your grandmother." The boy froze, eyes wide, surprised by the rare sternness in her tone. He pouted, then folded his arms and turned his back to her, sulking by the fence. Helen rubbed her leg, the ache dull but persistent. She was too shaken to speak further, so she sat quietly on the patio chair, letting the silence cool the air between them. Lucas eventually returned, curled up on the opposite end of the bench, and the rest of the visit passed in strained quiet. She never raised her voice again, nor did Lucas apologize. That evening, after Lucas had been picked up, Helen called her son David, more out of habit than concern. She recounted the incident in a light tone, chuckling nervously as she told him, "Your son gave me quite the surprise today. Kicked me in the leg when I said no to another popsicle. I gave him a bit of scolding. I think it shocked him." David was distracted on the phone, as usual, muttering a vague, "Kids can be wild sometimes," before changing the subject. Helen let it go. She didn't want to seem like she was complaining. She only hoped the small incident might prompt a gentle word from David or Jennifer. She went to bed early, her leg still throbbing. As she turned off the bedside lamp, Helen felt a twinge of unease she couldn't quite name. The day had left her unsettled, but she tried to brush it aside. Lucas was just a child. After all, children acted out. Tomorrow would be a new day, but tomorrow would not bring peace. Just after 9 o'clock the following morning, as Helen sipped her coffee and flipped through the morning paper, a sudden, thunderous banging echoed from the front door. It was a series of rapid, furious knocks, so loud and aggressive that her hand trembled, spilling coffee on her robe. Startled, she set the cup down and hurried to the door. Through the frosted glass panel, she could make out the silhouette of a woman. The form was unmistakable, tall, lean, with stiff shoulders and a tightly wound ponytail. Jennifer. Helen opened the door slowly, her mouth already forming a greeting, but she didn't get the chance to speak. "How dare you?" Jennifer screamed, her voice shrill and vibrating with rage. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the door wide open and stepped inside, eyes blazing. "You laid your hands on my son." Helen stumbled back, heart pounding. "Jennifer, what are you talking about? I didn't lay a hand on." "Don't lie to me," Jennifer shrieked, advancing into the living room. "He told me everything. You scared him, you screamed at him. What kind of person does that to a child?" Helen's throat went dry. "I didn't scream. He kicked me, and I told him it wasn't okay." "You traumatized him." Jennifer spat the words like venom. There was no reasoning with her. Helen tried again, this time with hands raised in a placating gesture, but Jennifer wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild, and her voice grew louder with every word. Neighbors had already begun to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. And then Jennifer reached out, grabbing Helen's arm so roughly it left marks, her other hand yanking at Helen's thinning hair. Helen cried out, not in pain but in sheer disbelief. The woman who had married her son, the mother of her grandson, was now screaming at her in her own home, pulling at her like an enemy, and her son, her only child, was nowhere in sight. Helen broke free, backing into the corner near the kitchen counter, breath shaking. "Get out of my house," she whispered, voice cracking. "Please, just go." Jennifer, breathing heavily, seemed to pause, as if realizing the scene she had made. With one last glare, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Outside, the world was still. A neighbor across the street stood frozen, garden hose limp in hand. Another peered from behind their curtain. Helen slowly slid down the wall, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. Something had changed that day, something she could no longer ignore. And for the first time in her life, Helen Miller felt truly alone. The sun had barely reached its midday height when Helen, still shaken from the morning's violent confrontation, began to notice a strange quietness on her street. She hadn't ventured outside, too humiliated to face the world after what had transpired in her living room. Her hands trembled as she moved about the house, attempting to tidy the room where Jennifer had unleashed her fury. But every object she picked up seemed to carry the weight of the morning's chaos. Her favorite lamp, knocked askew during the struggle, sat slightly tilted on the side table. A framed photo of Lucas as a toddler had fallen from its place on the mantel. She stared at it for a long time, unable to move. The doorbell rang just past 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This time, it wasn't a violent banging, but a single, deliberate chime that echoed like a warning. Heart pounding, Helen hesitated before approaching the door. Peeking through the curtain, she saw no one standing there, but as she opened it cautiously, her stomach dropped. Jennifer stood at the gate, her voice already rising before Helen could say a word. "You want to hide now?" she shouted, loud enough for anyone within 2 blocks to hear. "What? You think it's over?" Helen's mouth was dry. "Jennifer, please, not here, not like this." But Jennifer was beyond hearing. Her face was contorted with rage, and this time, she came with an audience in mind. She stepped closer to the gate and slammed her palm against it, rattling the iron bars. "My son came home crying because of you," she yelled. "You think people don't need to know what kind of person you are? You think you can just terrorize a child and get away with it?" Across the street, the elderly couple who lived in the blue house were now openly watching from their porch. A few doors down, a teenager paused mid-skate down the sidewalk. Curtains shifted in several windows. Helen stood frozen in the doorway, the quiet despair in her chest being replaced, slowly but surely, by something heavier: shame, anger, and the helplessness of being misjudged in the public square of her own neighborhood. Then Jennifer did something Helen never expected. She reached forward and unlatched the gate. Before Helen could protest, she stepped into the yard. "You think you're so innocent? You hit him. You scared him. You think your little act is going to fool anyone." Helen felt a heat rise to her face, a mix of fury and disbelief. "I did not hit him," she said, louder than she intended. "He kicked me, Jennifer. I told him it was wrong. That's all." "You raised your voice," Jennifer hissed, walking closer. "You scared a 6-year-old." Helen stepped back, the door still open behind her. She wanted to shut it, to retreat and lock out the nightmare that this woman had become. But she couldn't move. Her legs, still sore from the day before, held her in place. Jennifer advanced until she was barely 2 feet away. Her eyes scanned Helen, not with curiosity, but with disdain, the kind that cut deeper than words. Then she reached out and shoved Helen, one quick, brutal movement that sent her stumbling backward. A sharp cry escaped Helen's lips as her shoulder collided with the doorframe. The gasp that followed didn't come from her, but from the cluster of neighbors now watching. A man across the street shouted something. Helen couldn't make out what, but the tension in the air shifted immediately. Jennifer turned to the onlookers, her voice rising even further. "You all think she's just a sweet little grandmother? She's abusive. Ask my son. She should be ashamed." But the crowd that had initially been silent was no longer so sure. Helen, clutching her arm, eyes wide and watery, looked nothing like the villain Jennifer was painting. The woman who had lovingly baked cookies and tended her garden every day now stood bruised and trembling in her own doorway, the target of a one-sided war. It was then that Martha Sanders, Helen's next-door neighbor of 20 years, stepped through the hedge separating their yards. A no-nonsense woman in her 70s, Martha had seen enough. "That's enough, Jennifer," she said firmly, placing herself between Helen and her daughter-in-law. "You've made your point, and now you're trespassing." Jennifer turned to her, mouth agape. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Martha replied, her voice calm but steely. "You've been shouting for 15 minutes. You shoved her in front of half the neighborhood, and I saw you come through that gate. You're out of line." Jennifer scoffed, incredulous, but Martha didn't waver. Helen, breathless, finally closed the door behind her and leaned against it, locking it with trembling fingers. Through the wood, she could still hear the muffled sound of Jennifer's voice, though it was less certain now, more scattered. David arrived 10 minutes later. His car barely stopped before he was out the door and jogging toward the house. Helen, watching through the blinds, felt a flicker of hope until she saw where he was headed, straight to Jennifer. She watched as he wrapped his arms around his wife, leading her back to their car while nodding briefly to the curious onlookers who still lingered. He didn't look at the house. He didn't call her name. He didn't even check if she was all right. Helen stepped back from the window, the curtains slipping from her fingers. The silence in the house was deafening, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest until you could hardly breathe. In the kitchen, her phone buzzed. A message from Martha. "I saw everything. If you need anything, I'm right here." Helen stared at the screen for a long moment before placing the phone down carefully beside the fruit bowl. Her hands were still trembling. Her throat burned from holding back sobs she didn't want to let loose. She walked slowly to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection startled her. Her eyes were red, her hair askew, and a faint bruise was beginning to form on her arm. But what unsettled her most was not the appearance. It was a hollow expression, the disbelief that something so cruel could unfold in the middle of her peaceful life. That night, she didn't sleep, not even for a minute. By dawn, Helen had made a decision. She would no longer wait for her son to see her. She would no longer stand in silence while lies spread like wildfire. She had to protect herself. And maybe, in doing so, she would finally make her voice impossible to ignore. Helen sat at the small kitchen table, the early morning light casting long, pale rectangles across the linoleum floor. A cup of tea steamed beside her, untouched, growing colder by the minute. She held a notepad in her hand, blank except for one name, Martha Sanders. Underneath it, in neat, shaky letters, she had written a phone number. For hours she had sat in silence, replaying the past 2 days like a broken reel of film. No matter how many times she ran to the details, Lucas's outburst, Jennifer's intrusion, David's absence, the story remained the same. It always ended with the same bitter truth. She had been left alone to defend herself. At precisely 8 o'clock, she dialed the number. Martha answered on the second ring, her voice calm and warm. "Helen, I'm so glad you called. I've been worried sick." Helen hesitated, swallowing the tightness in her throat. I need help, she said softly. I can't let this continue. An hour later, Martha arrived with a folder of local resources, a thermos of strong coffee, and the firm, grounded demeanor of a woman who had handled her share of life storms. They sat together, side by side at the table, as Helen explained in full what had happened. Not just the events in the yard, but the feeling of being erased, misjudged, abandoned by her only son. She came into my home, Helen whispered, voice low and raw. She grabbed me, screamed at me, and David, he hasn't called once to check if I'm okay. Martha placed a hand over hers. You have every right to protect yourself, Helen, and I saw what happened. If you want to move forward with something formal, I'll stand with you. That afternoon, with Martha by her side, Helen visited the office of a local attorney. The small practice on Maple Street was run by a woman named Evelyn Rhodes, a sharp, empathetic attorney in her 40s, with a quiet confidence that immediately put Helen at ease. They sat in a private room, the blinds drawn, and Helen told her story once again, this time with the intention of being heard not only emotionally, but legally. Evelyn listened intently, taking notes but never interrupting. When Helen finished, she closed the folder and looked her in the eye. You have every legal ground to file a police report for physical assault, and I would recommend petitioning for a temporary restraining order. You're not just protecting yourself physically, Helen. You're making a boundary that tells your family, this behavior will not be tolerated. Helen nodded slowly. I don't want to ruin anyone's life. I want to be safe. I want them to know I'm not going to be treated like I'm invisible. The lawyer smiled gently. Then let's begin there. Within 24 hours, Helen had filed an official police report with the local department. A sympathetic officer, who had already heard murmurs from neighbors about the altercation, took her statement seriously. With Martha listed as a witness, the report carried weight. Evelyn moved quickly to draft a petition for a restraining order, citing both the physical assault and the pattern of verbal harassment that Helen had endured. It wasn't revenge Helen sought. It was a line in the sand, a formal declaration that she would no longer be silenced or minimized. As the paperwork progressed, Helen noticed subtle shifts in her world. Neighbors who once waved in passing now lingered a bit longer at their fences, some offering gentle support, others simply nodding in silent solidarity. Martha remained a constant presence, checking in daily, sometimes dropping off soup or just sitting with her through the long, hollow evenings. Meanwhile, the silence from David remained deafening. Days passed, and Helen received no calls, no messages, no effort at reconciliation. Jennifer, however, seemed to thrive on the silence. She had begun to reshape the narrative among mutual acquaintances, telling half-truths to school parents, twisting Helen's firm tone into screams, painting the scolding as something sinister. Helen overheard parts of these retellings while walking to the mailbox or shopping in town, always half-whispers and suspicious glances, just enough to sting. Still, she held firm. She attended her first meeting with Evelyn to prepare for the restraining order hearing, scheduled for the following week. The lawyer explained that the judge would initially review the petition and decide whether to issue a temporary order before hearing full testimony. Helen's stomach twisted at the thought of standing in court, recounting every humiliating detail. But Evelyn's presence helped. She wasn't alone anymore. One evening, as she sat rereading the court papers, Helen received a knock at her door, not loud, not frantic, just a calm rhythm of knuckles against wood. Her heart skipped. For a second, irrational hope bloomed in her chest. Maybe it was David. Maybe he had finally come to listen. But it wasn't her son. Standing on her porch was Officer Ramirez, the same officer who had taken her report. He held an envelope in his gloved hand and offered her a polite smile. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "I'm here to inform you that the temporary restraining order has been granted. Jennifer Miller is to remain at least 100 feet from your home and have no direct contact with you for the next 30 days. The court date to make it permanent is set for next week." Helen took the envelope, nodding slowly. "Thank you, officer. She'll be served tomorrow," he added, stepping back. "If anything happens between now and then, call us immediately." Helen stood for a moment after he left, holding the envelope like it weighed far more than paper. She had never imagined her life would reach this point. legal documents, court hearings, protective orders against her own daughter-in-law. And yet, beneath the sadness, there was something else: resolve. That night, she placed the court papers in her desk drawer and sat by the window, watching the breeze sway the branches of the maple trees. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a deep breath. It wasn't over, not by far, but she had drawn her line. And tomorrow, Jennifer would find out just how real that line had become. The morning after the restraining order was granted began with a deceptive calm. The sky outside Helen's window was washed in a delicate shade of gray, and the usual sound of the neighborhood filtered through the curtains: birds, the faint hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog. Helen moved through her morning routine with quiet deliberation. She fed the cat, boiled water for tea, and stood at the sink staring out into the backyard where the late summer flowers were beginning to droop. Her leg, still tender from the earlier incident, throbbed slightly with each step, a dull reminder of what had passed. By mid-morning, she received a call from Evelyn. The paperwork was delivered this morning. The attorney said calmly, "Officer Ramirez served it in person. Jennifer has officially been notified of the temporary restraining order. Legally, she's barred from contacting you in any way. If she does, we'll have grounds to press charges." Helen thanked her and hung up. A weight settled in her chest, not from fear, but from the uncertainty of what might follow. Jennifer was unpredictable, publicly explosive, privately cunning. Helen had braced herself for retaliation, but didn't know in what form it might come. She hadn't expected silence. For the rest of the day, her phone remained quiet. No messages, no calls, no threats. At dusk, she sat on her front porch sipping chamomile tea, glancing at the sidewalk where, days earlier, neighbors had paused to watch her humiliation unfold. Now, they passed by with cautious nods or tight-lipped smiles, not quite sure where to stand. Martha visited briefly, offering updates from her own corner of the neighborhood and gently reminding Helen to rest before the court hearing. The following morning, just after 9 o'clock, Helen heard the sound of tires crunching the gravel outside. She looked through the front window and saw David's car pull up slowly to the curb. Her pulse quickened. It had been over a week since she'd last seen him, since he had wordlessly taken his wife away without so much as a glance back. She remained at the window, unmoving, uncertain whether to open the door. David stepped out of the car wearing jeans and a wrinkled polo shirt. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed and movement slow. For a long moment, he stood on the sidewalk, staring at the front door as if unsure of his place. Then finally, he climbed the porch steps and knocked. Helen opened the door cautiously. David raised a hand in a half-wave. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" She hesitated. The door barely cracked. "Are you alone?" He nodded. "Yes. Jennifer doesn't know I'm here." After a pause, Helen opened the door wider and stepped aside. David walked in slowly, his eyes scanning the room like he hadn't seen it in years. He took a seat at the edge of the couch, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Helen sat opposite him, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry I haven't called," he began. "I've been trying to understand everything. I didn't want to come here angry. I didn't want to say something I couldn't take back." Helen didn't speak. She waited. David sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Lucas told us about what happened, but he didn't say you hit him. That part didn't come from him. Jennifer said he was scared, that he was crying, that you yelled." "I didn't hit him," Helen said quietly. "I told him it wasn't okay to kick me. That was it." "I believe you now," David admitted. "I think I did even then. But I didn't know how to deal with Jennifer's reaction. She gets intense." And I froze. Helen looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't ask me if I was okay. You didn't call. You let her scream at me in front of the neighborhood, shove me, pull my hair, and then you left." "I know," he said, eyes dropping to the floor. "And I'm ashamed. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I can." She said nothing for a while, the silence between them filled only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, David spoke again. "There's something I didn't tell you. Something I found out 2 days ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. Helen raised an eyebrow, her voice cool. What is it? I was going through some insurance documents. He began slowly, and I saw a record from 2 years ago. You were admitted to the hospital. They listed it as a fall, but there was mention of high blood pressure and emotional distress. I called the hospital. They said it was stress-related. Something about fainting. I had no idea. Helen sat still, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't tell anyone. Jennifer had just lost her job. You were working overtime. Lucas was sick every other week. It didn't seem like the right time to be a burden. You're not a burden, David said, the words catching his throat. You never were. But I let her keep me at a distance. I let her control what I knew and didn't know. I didn't ask questions. I just let it happen. There was a heaviness in the room that neither of them could name, the weight of years lost, of words unsaid and assumptions made. Helen studied her son's face, the boy she had raised, now a man finally seeing her not as an extension of his life, but as a person in her own right. I'm not angry you didn't know, she said softly. I'm angry you want to know. David's eyes glistened, but he nodded. I deserve that. They sat in silence again, a silence less hostile, more uncertain. I've started therapy, he added after a moment. It's court recommended, but it's helping. Jennifer is going, too. It's required under the terms of the restraining order. But we're not living together right now. I've taken Lucas to my sister's for the week. Helen's breath caught. You left. I needed space. And perspective, he said. Lucas asks about you every day. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he misses you. I told him you're okay. She looked down at her hands. I want to see him again, but I can't pretend nothing happened. Things have to be different. I know, David said, and they will, if it means supervised visits, if it means we work through someone else. I'll do it. I just want him to know he still has his grandmother, that you're still here. Helen nodded slowly, her voice quiet. Then we start there. When David left that afternoon, there was no dramatic goodbye, no tears or promises, just a tentative understanding, a fragile step towards something that had been broken. Helen watched his car disappear down the street, then turned back into the house. With a quiet, didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. She knew the hearing was still to come, and the path ahead would not be simple. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she no longer felt erased. Her voice had found its way through the noise. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to be heard. The courthouse sat quietly under a heavy sky, the kind of weather that hovered between rain and stillness. Helen stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse doors, her handbag clutched tightly in her hands. She was dressed simply, pressed slacks, a navy cardigan buttoned neatly over her blouse, and yet she felt more exposed than she had in her entire life. This was the moment everything became real in a way that paper and phone calls had not fully captured. She wasn't just a grandmother or a neighbor anymore. She was a plaintiff in a court proceeding against her own family. The thought was dizzying, but she kept her back straight as Evelyn arrived and offered a brief nod of assurance. Inside the courtroom, the setting was modest but suffocating in its formality. The hum of whispers filled the air before the session began. Helen noticed Jennifer enter with her lawyer, young, sharp, and aggressively polished. Jennifer looked composed, though her eyes flicked around the room with quick, tight movements. There was no acknowledgement between them. David was present, seated in one of the benches toward the back. He looked drawn but alert, a marked difference from the passive silence he had worn in the weeks before. Helen met his gaze briefly, and in that instant, she saw a kind of quiet resolve behind his fatigue. When the judge entered and the case was called, Helen's breath steadied. Evelyn spoke first, presenting a calm, clear summary of the petition, supported by the police report, medical documentation of the physical bruising, and Martha's written testimony. The judge read through the documents carefully, occasionally glancing at Helen, occasionally taking notes. Jennifer's lawyer objected to the language used in the filing, suggesting exaggeration, but the judge silenced the interruption with a raised hand and asked Helen to take the stand. Her walk to the witness seat was slow, but purposeful. Once seated, Helen answered the questions clearly, never raising her voice, never embellishing. She described the fear, the shock, the pain, not just physical, but emotional. She explained that this was not an attempt to sever family ties, but a necessary step to establish boundaries and safety. When Evelyn asked her what outcome she hoped for, Helen paused. "I want peace," she said, "not revenge. I want to feel safe in my home again. I want to be able to protect myself without being called a liar or being attacked. And I want to be part of my grandson's life in a way that's healthy for everyone." Jennifer's attorney cross-examined her with practiced efficiency, pressing her on details of tone and language, trying to frame the incident as a misunderstanding between generations. Helen didn't waver. She remained poised, and when asked if she regretted filing the petition, she replied with quiet confidence, "No, because if I hadn't, I would have disappeared into the background of my own life." When it was Jennifer's turn to speak, she did so with visible restraint. Her words were measured, coached. She acknowledged the escalation that day, admitted to entering Helen's yard uninvited, but framed her actions as protective, driven by maternal instinct. She denied any physical contact beyond accidental brushing. Despite the evidence submitted, her voice remained even until a judge asked her directly whether she had touched Helen with force. Her mouth tightened before she replied, "I don't recall happening that way." Helen's eyes didn't leave her daughter-in-law's face. She wasn't expecting remorse, but the lack of it still cut. The session lasted just under 2 hours. The judge requested a brief recess before delivering his decision. During that break, David approached Helen outside the courtroom. His expression was cautious, but the tension in his shoulders seemed lighter than before. "I know this isn't how any of us wanted things to go," he said, voice low, "but I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." Helen nodded, her voice tight. "It shouldn't have taken all this to be seen." "I know," he said. "I should have seen you sooner." They stood in silence until the bailiff called everyone back. The final ruling was succinct. The judge found sufficient evidence to grant a formal restraining order valid for 6 months, with the possibility of review and extension. Jennifer was ordered to attend a 12-week counseling program on anger management and respectful communication. Additionally, visitation rights for Lucas will be subject to supervised conditions, with the supervision arranged by a neutral third-party service approved by the court. Jennifer's reaction was unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even glance in Helen's direction. She simply gathered her things and left, her lawyer whispering something hurried as they exited the courtroom. Back at home, the house felt different. Not larger, not emptier, just different. The air didn't carry the same heaviness. The silence didn't echo quite the same way. Helen sat at the dining table that evening, reading through a formal court paperwork Evelyn had left her with. It was strange to hold a document that said, in plain legal terms, that she had the right to feel safe. But it was also empowering. It was proof, finally, that her pain had not been imagined, that her voice had not dissolved into the wind. A few days later, David called to schedule a visit for Lucas. The service would provide a neutral supervisor for the initial visits, held in a designated center designed for safe, controlled interactions. Helen agreed, cautiously optimistic. She knew it would take time to rebuild trust, not just with her family, but with herself. Still, the thought of seeing her grandson again, of watching him play without fear or confusion, gave her a reason to look forward. On the day of their first supervised visit, Helen arrived early. The room was quiet, with a few chairs, a small table of toys, and a large window letting in soft afternoon light. She waited nervously, unsure how Lucas would react after the whirlwind of adult chaos he had been caught in. When the door finally opened and he stepped in, small and hesitant, Helen stood slowly. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Lucas ran to her, arms outstretched, and hugged her tightly around the waist. "I missed you, Grandma," he whispered into her cardigan. Tears pricked her eyes as she held him close. "I miss you too, sweetheart. So much." They spent the next hour playing quietly, drawing pictures, building small towers with plastic blocks. There was laughter, hesitance, small glances of uncertainty, but no fear. When it was time to leave, Lucas turned and waved as he walked out the door with the supervisor, leaving behind the drawing he had made, a lopsided house with a tall flower and two stick figures holding hands. Helen took the drawing and tucked it carefully into her purse. She had not won a battle. She had claimed her space. And now, piece by piece, she would begin again with love, with limits, and with the courage to never shrink into silence again.